Welcome to question 59 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this video is injustice, and I am Dr. Thibault. I'm looking at, in this section, the issues of justice in itself. That's these first four questions that begin the very long section of the virtue of justice. So, injustice, is where we're at. Now, injustice, according to St. Thomas, is a special vice. It's also a general vice. Um, since justice is sometimes a special virtue, sometimes it's a general virtue, so is injustice. So injustice in response, then, if it is a responding to a specific virtue, then it becomes a specific vice. And if it's responding to a general virtue, it becomes a general vice. Fairly straightforward. He says injustice is twofold. Injustice, it can be done through illegal injustice, which is opposed to legal justice. And legal justice aims at the common good. So when there's been an injustice to the common good, it can be both general or specific. So it can be a special vice when it's opposed to special object, which is the common good. So when one particularly attacks the common good, then it would be a special vice. And if one has just general contempt for the common good, then it is a general vice. So something like the attack on Twin Towers, for example, was an attack not on any particular individual. I'm not sure the terrorists who flew the planes into these buildings were aware of any particular individual who was in those buildings. The object of the attack wasn't the president or the Senate when they hit the trade center. They were aiming at creating terror for the common good. Because of that, that would be an act against. That would be a special vice because it attacked specifically the common good, versus a grumpy person who just doesn't like anyone. And if you just have general contempt for the common good, then it's just a general vice, right? You're just a disagreeable, grumpy person, then it could be an injustice towards everyone in general, not somebody in particular. And really not aiming at destroying the common good, just probably unvirtuous in numerous ways, including towards the common good. Now, injustice as in inequality between two people we're talking then about particular virtues, right? If you go back to question 58, you'll see that if you're talking about between individuals, then you're talking about particular virtue, and therefore you would be talking about a particular vice. So get into that later as well. When we look at Article 2, does injustice cause a man to be unjust? Now, you would, if you know something about St. Thomas and you know something about Aristotle, you might tend to think that yes, action follows being. What a person does is who a person is. So if a person does injustice, then they are an unjust person. The idea of habitus, right? Character. This is the first objection to Article 2, but St. Thomas, a little bit surprisingly when I read it, is counter to that idea. He uses a line in the Contra from Aristotle: a man may do unjust things without being unjust. So you can do an unjust thing without being unjust. Well, how does that work? Doesn't that counteract action follows being? Well, this is what he explains. So when sometimes actions don't create a habit of injustice in particular ways. He gives two examples. So he says, well, if one doesn't intend to do the unjust thing directly, then one only does the unjust thing indirectly or materially. Um, this is done by ignorance. And an example I can think of for this is, let's say, the cashier at the grocery store was supposed to give the customer $20 back. Maybe they paid with a $50 bill and they were owed $20 back as change, and the teller at the register accidentally hands over $10. So the person has been cheated by $10. There's been an injustice to that person. But if it was done unintentionally, they weren't aware of the fact that they were doing it, then the person isn't an unjust person. The person's just a bad cashier. There's a difference between being a bad cashier and being an unjust person, a person who practices injustice. That would be done by ignorance. Could be other virtues that were violated if they have other problems, but they aren't by definition an unjust person by doing that. And if you think, well, what does it mean to be unjust materially? That just means in the exterior world or the external acts. So when the cashier handed over $10 instead of $20, they acted with injustice materially, meaning inaction. The action itself was unequal, therefore it is an injustice. Materially, the person didn't intend to do it, so it's not an injustice formally, but it is an injustice materially because that's what actually happened. Now, he also points out that injustice can result from the passions. So if a person um, yeah, is experiencing anger, there can be an injustice that is comes about indirectly because of the direct act, which was anger, which is a result of the passion. So, and if you recall from the previous section, passions deal with the sensitive appetite, whereas justice is dealing with the rational or the intellectual appetite. So justice is dealing with an act of the will. So if this is a result of the act of the passions or the sensitive appetite, then it is only indirectly aiming at injustice. It is directly dealing with passions. So maybe the person isn't an unjust person. Maybe the person is an angry person, and their injustice is just a consequence of their anger, right? So that would be different than a person who's intentionally unjust. Um, Although I tend to think that all injustices are in some ways secondary to something else. There's a way in which you are unjust. You know, if you are unjust because you steal from someone, you can't say, well, I'm not unjust, I'm just a thief. Well, your thieving is what made you unjust. So I think in some ways it's always secondary. Um, Someone who acts intentionally or by habit is unjust, though. So if a person has a habitus of injustice or one intentionally acts unjustly, um, right? The person who, uh, the cashier who instead of giving $20 for change intentionally gives $10 for change, puts the other $10 in their own pocket. Well, that would be thieving. Therefore, it would be unjust, and that would be intentionally unjust. Therefore, their character would be an unjust person because it's something that they've chosen. And if a person steals regularly, then they might have a habitus of injustice, and then they might be an unjust person. Question 3 is, can one willingly suffer injustice? Um, it's kind of, I think the most interesting thing, the most interesting part of this Article 3 is not St. Thomas's primary answer, which usually that's the most interesting thing is the primary answer. The I answer that is the key to it. And if you have time, then you read the answers to the objections. But in this case, I think actually his answers to objection 3 is the most interesting part of this question and probably, I think, answers it more clearly than even his first answer. And this is, can a person suffer injustice willingly? He said, well, you have to look at it from a formal element and from a material element. So from a formal element, you're dealing with what people are intending to do. And when you're dealing with a material element, as already discussed, it is what one does externally, what one does in action. So, can one suffer injustice? Well, it depends if you're talking about formally or materially. So, um, so materially, there must always be one who does the injustice and another who suffers injustice. So that's just materially required. You can't have an injustice which hasn't been done by anyone, right? An injustice requires two people. It's a particular. We're dealing with particular virtues in this sense, particular vices. Um, if one intends to do injustice to someone formally, so the person intends to do something wrong. Uh, but the injustice takes place, can only take place if it's done uh, involuntarily, materially. Um, so therefore, one must always be unwilling to suffer an injustice for it to be an injustice. If you willingly uh, suffer it, if you willingly give it, then it's not technically an injustice. So if we think of it as an example, when Jean Valjean steals the silver from the priest in Les Miserables, uh, Javert is on his trail and catches him and returns him to the priest and says, we caught the thief that stole your silver. And the priest responds, oh, why did you leave so soon? You forgot this too. He didn't steal it. I gave it to him as a gift. And he gives him um, candlestick as well. Um, so the person, Jean Valjean, in that situation, intended to create an injustice, an inequality, taking what was not his. But because the priests, so formally, Jean Valjean intended to commit an injustice. Now, the priest, because he forgave him and he gave it to him willingly, because he gave it to him willingly, therefore there was no injustice. Um, so if the priestess said, oh, he stole my silver. I can't believe he stole my silver. Give it back. Well, now there has been an injustice because he didn't give it willingly. Um, right? If the cashier uh, instead of giving you the $20, gives you the $10, and you know that they're stealing the other $10, but you think, I think the person needs it more than me, I'll let him keep it. I won't say anything. Well, then it's not an injustice because you have voluntarily given that $10 to that person. Were aware of it. So there is a difference. So the person who intends to do the injustice, they still are dealing with that level of attempting to wrong someone. They still have they still have a sin on them for intending to defraud somebody, but they haven't been guilty of injustice because no injustice has occurred because it requires a material injustice for there to be a formal injustice. Um, is injustice always a mortal sin? Um, this is question 4, the final question, and these are one of those complicated ones that you see quite often, where he comes out very strong and then comes up with many exceptions. So whoever does an injustice sins morally. Therefore, yes, right. So Every injury inflicted on another person in itself is contrary to charity. Anything that is contrary to charity is contrary to God. It breaks union with God and therefore is a mortal sin. Uh, Charity moves us to will the good of another. If you are intending to create an injustice, then you don't will the good of another. Um, Now the exceptions. Exception is this is an interesting one. It uses from Aristotle, but this quote is even present in American law today. It's amazing how far back some things go. Ignorance of fact uh, is not injustice, only accidentally, versus ignorance of law, which is not an excuse. That's still the law today. You know, if you ever get pulled over by a police officer, you can't say, "Oh, I didn't know what the speed limit was," because ignorance of the law is not an excuse. If you said, "Oh, I didn't know how fast I was going," that actually might work, depending on the police officer, um, because maybe you didn't know how fast you were going, you know, so you weren't weren't knowingly breaking the law. So there's a requirement to know what the law is. If you're going to drive on the roads, you need to know what the law is. But there could always be ignorance of the fact. You can never have ignorance of the law. So if you were to have ignorance of the fact, right, that the cashier who accidentally gives $10 instead of $20, that was ignorance, excuse me, of the fact that the bill should have been a $20 bill and was instead they were giving a $10 bill. So therefore, they've committed an injustice by accident. There's been an accidental injustice because of ignorance of the fact. If a person said, "Oh, I thought I could keep that money myself," well, that ignorance of the law, you know, that you think that you can steal, um, that's not an excuse. That's injustice. So, in the earlier example of accidentally giving $10, that's not a mortal sin because it um, wasn't intentionally trying to hurt anybody. There was no, it wasn't not willing the good of good of another. Didn't violate charity to accidentally give someone $10 instead of 20, versus if you intended to create an inequality, then yes, it would be mortal. Uh, he St. Thomas also brings up this idea that if it's so small that it would be an injustice, but it doesn't really hurt anyone or displease anyone, like taking an apple from someone, is so small that it might not even really be an injustice if maybe it was your friend, and if you had just asked, they would have said, "Oh, take it." If you knew that they were going to say just take it and you just took it, maybe the injustice would have been so slight, you know, that it wouldn't be an injustice at all. Therefore, it wouldn't be a mortal sin. Now, between those two extremes of violation of charity versus it might not even be a sin, there would, of course, be some situations in which it might be a venial sin. Um, uh, St. Thomas doesn't give a specific example of this, but it's all to the level of degree. So if you took an apple and it might not have been an injustice, what if you took two apples or three apples, right? There's always to a degree. It doesn't go from not a sin to mortal sin without uh, through the degree of the potential venial sin. So in conclusion, injustice is a special virtue, a special vice, because it deals with special virtues, and it is also a general vice because it also deals with general virtues. So, it, unjust acts don't always create an unjust man. If you recall, so from ignorance or from passions, one could create an injustice, but only secondarily or accidentally or materially, but not necessarily intentionally, formally. Uh, Injustice is always suffered unwillingly. If If the victim party decides at some point in this transaction that they are going to give it to you as a gift, therefore it's not unwilling at that point, then it's no longer an injustice because one has voluntarily given it as a gift. Because it's a gift, it can't be an injustice. There's an equality there because it was given freely. And lastly, direct or formal injustice is always a mortal sin. However, there are examples where uh, it is not an injustice, therefore it is not a mortal sin. The last section on justice in itself comes next, question 60, which deals with judgment. And I will see you then.